1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 12. First Timothy chapter 4, verse 12. Let no one look down on your youthfulness, but rather in speech, conduct, love, faith, and purity, show yourself an example of those who believe. The word of the Lord.
Brother, good morning. All right. Sister Bacon had to leave. She was not feeling well. So let's remember her in our prayers. I like flashlights. All of my kids like flashlights. Maybe it's a kid thing. I like flashlights. I like shopping for flashlights. When I'm shopping for a flashlight, I'm looking at several things, but the most important, of course, is the lumens, right? Or if it's used to, it was the candle watt power. Now it's lumens, and I found out you can't compare candle watt to lumens. It's measured completely different, and every article I've read on it says you can't do that. There's no way to compare the two. So anyway, lumens, that's what I'm looking at whenever I'm looking for one of these new LED flashlights. And I just got one and for Christmas, and one of the uses for it was, hiking, hunting, camping, security. And it showed a picture of a guy shining light in the bad guy's face, because it's so bright it could blind them. And it is that bright. You're not supposed to shine in somebody's face. But anyway, I'm searching through this, and I've bought flashlights before that advertised that they were, 150 lumens. And you get that flashlight in the mail, and it's a piece of junk. And you get what you pay for. But they try to convince you that it's all bright, and it really isn't near as bright as they advertise that it is. Satan works sort of like that with our influence, our example. Jesus said that our example was a city set on a hill that cannot be hidden. It's bright at night. You can see it far off. He said our example is that light that we don't want to hide under the bushel, like we sing with the kids. And it's a bright light that needs to be seen by everyone else. But Satan does a very good job of making us think that our light is just as bright as it's always been, whenever it's been getting a little dimmer and a little dimmer and a little dimmer, and until really no one can see it very well. It's like that cheap flashlight that, you get out there and you put it next to the real thing, and you can see the difference. But if you're not next to the real thing, you don't see the difference. And Satan does a really good job of convincing us that we're okay with where we are, and our example is okay. The Apostle Paul, speaking to Timothy there in 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 12, tells Timothy to... If you back up to the beginning of the chapter and read through, he's giving some exhortation to Timothy and what he needs to do. Timothy's a preacher there. He's giving him, and he's a young preacher there, and he's giving him instruction on what he needs to do. One of the things he says he needs to do is, maintain his faith. He needs to continue to read the scriptures daily and read them aloud to the congregation, and to explain those scriptures to the congregation. He needs to do a number of things, but there in verse 12, he says you need to be an example in speech, in conduct, in love, in faith, in purity. He was the example for them. He needed to be the example for them. Charles Spurgeon wrote, "A man's life is more forcible than his speech. When men take stock of him, they reckon his deeds as dollars and his words as pennies. If his life and doctrine disagree, the mass of onlookers accept his practice and reject his preaching." What does that mean? That means that, we can say one thing, but if we're not practicing what we're saying people aren't going to listen to us, and they're more likely to do what we're doing instead of what we are preaching. As parents, there's a big danger of us doing that and our children seeing us not practicing what we preach, and then their comment is, well, you don't do it, that sort of thing. And we've got to be careful of that. Now, I want to address each of these subjects that the Apostle Paul tells Timothy to be an example in. But for today, we're going to look at the subject of love, because I think that Satan has done a real good job of dimming our light in this area, or making us think that certain things are loving, certain things are not loving. What we want to do this morning is look at 3 points. What does the Bible, what does God want us to love? What does God want us not to love? And then finally, what does all of that look like in our lives? So let's start then. What are some things that God wants us to love? We could go back all the way to the Old Testament, and even Christ reiterating it in the New Testament whenever he was asked the question, what's the greatest commandment? What was his response? Let's turn in our Bibles to Matthew chapter 22. Matthew chapter 22. And I think we all know what his response was, but we're going to read it. Matthew 22, verse 37. There, Jesus said, he answers that question, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. Love the Lord your God. That's it. That's the number one thing in a Christian's life, or in anyone's life. This is what needs to come first. This is what we are to love. We're to love our God. But he says we're to love him with what? It's all our, what did he say? He said we're to love him with all of our heart, with all of our soul, and with all of our mind. Well, then, if we look deep into this, what will we maybe say loving God with all of our heart was? I think we could associate heart with our emotion, right? With our emotional side of things. And loving God deep down inside. But what about loving the Lord our God with all of our soul? When we think of soul, we think of what is eternal about man. And this is something we're to love God with all of what is eternal about us. What will go on into eternity. What about our minds? I think this goes into the logic, doesn't it? And in order to love the Lord our God with all of our minds, Satan is constantly trying to put those seeds of doubt into our minds. So we must do as the Apostle Paul instructed the Thessalonians, to prove all things, hold fast to that which is good. If I'm going to love the Lord my God with all of my mind, then I'm going to have to come to the conclusion that he is God and that his word is true. I need to love the Lord my God with all my heart, with all my soul, and with all my mind. And as Jesus is speaking these words, and this is something that was told the Jews back under the law of Moses as well, but this encompasses all of man, his heart, his soul, and his mind. In other words, I'm to love the Lord my God with all that I am. What else am I to love? You know, as I'm thinking about this, the Apostle Paul said that I am to be, or that Timothy was to be an example to the believers in all of those areas, but we're focusing on love. So Timothy was to be an example in love. If I'm going to be an example in love to those around me, I need to know what to love and how to share that love with others. First, I'm to love the Lord my God with all my heart, my soul, and my mind. I'm also to, John chapter 13, verse 33 and 34, I'm to love my brethren. John chapter 13, we recall here that Jesus this is the day before his crucifixion. This is the day that he is going to be betrayed. This is the evening before he is betrayed. And he says to his disciples there, his apostles, in verse 33 says, "Little children, yet a little while and I am with you. You will seek me, and just as I said to the Jews, so now I say to you, where I am going you cannot come. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, just as I have loved you. You also are to love one another. By this will all people know that you are my disciples, if you have love one for another." And so here's something else that God expects me, that God expected Timothy to love. And we also see that part of being an example here. What did Jesus tell these apostles their love for one another would do? What would that example do? It would tell the world that they were what? That they were his disciples. People would know that they were disciples of Christ because of their love for one another. Do other people in the world love one another? Sure, there are some that love one another. But this was going to be and should be something that was seen always among Christians. Something that was so apparent all of the time that it would be a badge of discipleship. That love would be a badge of discipleship, that other people could recognize them by this badge. They're to love one another. I hope that as we're going through this, I encourage you, challenge you to examine your love and the things that you do love. Do we love the Lord our God with all that we are? Can I say I love the Lord my God with all my heart, soul, and mind if there are areas of my life where I rebel against Him? You say, well, I don't rebel against God. Well, if there are areas in your life where you don't obey Him, you are in direct rebellion against God. So can I say I love the Lord my God with all my heart, mind, and soul? What about my brethren? Do others know that I'm a disciple of Christ by the love that I have for my brethren? And not just some of them, not just the ones I like, but all of them. You say, well, James, they're just not loving to me. How can I love them back? Well, we're going to get to that point in a moment, because our last point of things that we're to love are our enemies. And if God expects me to love my enemies, surely He expects me to love all of my brethren, even those that might be a little tough to get along with. I'm to Ephesians chapter 4, verse 15. I'm also to love the truth. I'm to love the truth. Ephesians 4:15 says, rather, speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up in every way into Him who is head, into Christ. Speaking the truth in love. I think we can take this two ways, really. Speaking the truth in love of the truth, but speaking the truth in love also of those to whom I am speaking. If I love those souls that are lost, then what am I going to do? I'm going to speak the truth to them, because the truth is capable of doing what? Making men free of their sins, John 8:32. So I want to share this truth. But there are those, unfortunately, in the world that do not love the truth. And we don't want to fall into that same category, do we? So let's examine our lives. Are there areas in my life where maybe I don't love the truth? Am I ashamed to share it with others? Romans chapter 1, verse 16, the Apostle Paul said, I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. And then he gave the reason why. Because it was the power of God to save men. say, well, I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ either. We all have people in our lives that are lost. Have we shared the gospel of Christ with them? The only message that is able to make them free from their sins. Why have we not shared that message with them? Are we afraid of how they might respond to it? Surely that could be the case. But if I have a friend, he's walking down this path, I know there's danger down this road. There's a lion. There's a lion down this path. And this guy, he's set on going down this path, and he's heard others say, no, there's no lion down that path. You go ahead and go on down that, whatever path you want. But you know there's a lion down that path. And that lion will take his life. What are you going to do? Well, we're going to stop them. And with everything that we have, we'll do whatever we can to stop them from going down the wrong path. Well, if we truly believe there is a heaven, we truly believe there is a hell, and that those who are lost will spend eternity there in hell, then we will do everything that we can to keep them from going there. What about our enemies? So we're to love the Lord our God, we're to love one another, we're to love the truth. What about our enemies? Jesus said in Luke chapter 6, verse 26, that we are to even love our enemies. I want us to turn there because he says a few other things here that are important to the context of the statement. Luke chapter 6, verse 27. Luke 6, 27. He says, "But I say to you who hear, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. To the one who strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. And from one who takes away your cloak, do not withhold your tunic either. Give to everyone who begs from you. And from one who takes away your goods, do not demand them back. And as you wish others would do to you, do so to them." There's our golden rule, coupled with our command here to love our enemies. Why does God want us to love our enemies? Think about it in connection to the golden rule. Does the golden rule only apply to people we like? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Does it not apply to everyone? Certainly it does apply to everyone, and our enemies fall into that category. And what I want them to do to me, I want them to love me. Why? Because that's what God expects of them. That's what God expects of me. And when we have this love for one another and we have this love for the truth, there's that possibility, that door of opportunity that may open up with our enemies, that they might be changed by the love of Christ. These are some things that we are to love in our lives. But there are also some things that are commanded in the Scripture that we are not to love. Can you think of some of those things? Think for a moment. What are some things that God has commanded us not to love? We might be thinking of the word hate at this point. And we'll go back to when Jesus is teaching his disciples in Luke chapter 14. Luke chapter 14, verse 26. He said to them there something that was a very strange, I'm sure, coming across to them. Luke chapter 14, verse 26. The 25 says the crowds accompanied him and turned and said to them, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple." You might say, well, wow, Jesus wants me to hate? That's not the point of the passage. Let's continue reading and we'll begin to understand the passage a little better. He says, "Whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple." What is Jesus talking about? He's talking about what direction, what's important in your life. What's the most important thing in your life? It should be God. But for some, the most important thing in our lives is our family. Is it wrong for our family to be important in our lives? No, it's just wrong whenever the importance of our family comes before God. You might recall some years back when Christmas fell on a Sunday. I don't know how many denominational commercials I heard on the radio, saw on television, where they had canceled their services and said, this is a day for families and we should spend this day at home with our families. And I just got to thinking, that's what Jesus was talking about. Loving family more than Him. The first day of the week is not for our family. The first day of the week is not even for us. The first day of the week is our worship to God. Our worship to Him should be number one in our lives always. And so, what are we not to love? We're not to love our families more than God. What else are we not to love? When we look at Scripture, we see the Apostle John in 1 John chapter 2. 1 John chapter 2, he warns the brethren, whom he calls my little children. So you get an idea of the age of the Apostle John at this time. He's very old, and he is speaking to these Christians, and he warns them in verse 15, do not love the world or the things of the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh and the desires of the eye and the pride in possessions is not from the Father, but is of the world. And the world is passing away along with its desires, but whoever does the will of God abides forever. So what are we not to love? We're not to love the world. We're not to love the things of the world. Why? Because those things are temporal. And what will those things do? Those things will pull us away from God. And I know this because I can go all the way back to Genesis chapter 3 and see these very temptations taking place in the life of Adam and Eve. And what did that do for them? I think we all know the story there. What happened with Adam and Eve? They're enticed to sin. And that sin caused a separation between them and God that will forever be remembered. So these are some things we're not to love. You could probably think of a whole host of other things we're not to love or we're not to love, such as, and this probably falls into the category of loving not the world or the things in the world, but the Apostle Paul warns Timothy that the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. So there's another thing in the world that we're warned not to love. So we see the Scriptures teach us what to love. They teach us what not to love. But what does this that Paul is encouraging Timothy to do? Be an example in love, Timothy. An example is something you can see. And that's what Timothy's being encouraged to do here. Be something that the brethren can see in love. What does that look like? Let's turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 13. I think where the subject of love, the definition of love is really given the best in all of Scripture. In 1 Corinthians chapter 13, we are given an example of love. We're given a very picture of it. And I want you to, as we read through this, try to imagine these images that the Apostle Paul is describing here in these first 4 verses, or first 3 verses. He says there, verse 1, if I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I'm a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. You have to recall that during this time, the Christians had miraculous abilities, and one of those miraculous abilities was to be able to speak in numerous different languages, which would have helped to spread the gospel. And it was looked upon as an awesome gift to be able to speak in other languages. And so it was lifted up, that gift was. And so if you had that gift, it was something that some of them kind of boasted about. And the Apostle Paul says here, if I had this gift, but I don't have love, if I'm not loving the Lord my God with all my heart, with all my soul, with all my mind, if I'm not loving one another, my brethren, if I don't love the truth, and yea, if I don't even love my enemies, I'm just a noisy instrument. I'm a noisy instrument. He goes on, and if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and knowledge, and if I have all faith so I can remove mountains, imagine knowing somebody like that and how incredible that must be to be that wise and to have that sort of faith. And then he says, but if I don't have love, I am nothing. What? The ability to prophesy, that sort of wisdom of knowing all mysteries. How many of you have ever wished that you completely understood everything that about creation? That's all of us, right? There are lots of questions we have, and we are looking forward to answers in eternity, right? Understanding all mysteries. If you don't have love, it's nothing. And he doesn't say if you don't have love. He says if I have these things and I don't love, I am nothing. Paul is using himself as the example here. And when we look to the Scriptures and we think of the apostles, it's hard to find or to say that one apostle was greater than the others. But when we look at the Apostle Paul and see his example and his faith, we are greatly encouraged. But he says, if I have not love, I'm nothing. Verse 3, if I give away all I have, and if I deliver my body up to be burned, I give away all. You think of somebody who's willing to do something like that, to give away everything that they have, and even to give their body in sacrifice. But I don't have love, I gain nothing. I give everything that I have, even myself, but if I don't have love, if I didn't give it out of love, I'm nothing. I gain nothing. Paul goes on in the rest of this chapter to define love. So this is what love looks like. And I've often done this, and this is not original with me. Someone shared this with me a long time ago. But it gives a vivid picture of what love looks like when we remove the word love and we put ourselves in the place of the word love there. I'm going to read this, and I'm going to put my name in there. I hope you'll do the same as you read through this, and it will cause you to think, is this true about me? Because this is what my life will look like if I'm following after this commandment to be an example in love. Right? Let's read. James is patient and kind. I'm not always patient. I have to say that. I struggled with it a little yesterday when a 5-hour trip turned into a 9-hour trip. And sometimes we're in a hurry to get home from work or to get to work. Had a long day. A bunch of unruly patients. A lot of people that just didn't want to see things our way. And it makes it hard to be kind, doesn't it? Sometimes we respond in unkind ways. James does not envy or boast. That's a tough one to struggle with as well. James is not arrogant or rude. James does not insist on his own way. I like to have my way. I think we all do. And is it wrong to want our way? No, I don't believe it's wrong to want our way, but It's loving. The loving thing is to let our brethren, our friends have their way, our spouse have their way. James is not irritable or resentful. You know, that's a tough one. I think maybe we struggle the most with our spouse with. Not resentful, not irritable. James does not rejoice at wrongdoing. Does making jokes about sinful things fall into this category? James rejoices with the truth. James bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. That's a tough standard, but it is the definition of love. This is what it looks like in our lives. We can see what it looks like in the Apostle Paul's life in 2 Timothy chapter 4. As he describes the end of his life, he says in chapter 4, verse 6, "For I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure has come." What does Paul say? I've poured out my life for Christ. This is love. He did this because he loved Christ, and because he loved his brethren, and because he loved the lost. He says, I have fought a good fight, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give unto me in that day. Not to me only, but unto all those also who love his appearing. We see what love looks like also in the life of Christ. What did Jesus say in the Gospel of John in chapter 15, verse 13? He said, there's no greater love than what? For a man to lay down his life for his friends. And that's exactly what Christ did. He laid down his life for you and for me. So the Bible shows us what to love, it tells us what not to love, and it shows us what love looks like. So I want us to finish with Romans chapter 5. Romans chapter 5. And then we're going to sing the song of invitation. We're going to encourage anyone who has any need, whether it's to obey the gospel, putting Christ on in baptism for the remission of your sins today, or it's you've already done this, but you've fallen away and you need the prayers of your brothers and sisters, or maybe there's something you're struggling with in your life that you need help with, and we can help you. We certainly want to do what we can. In Romans chapter 5, beginning at verse 6, it says, For while we were still weak at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. For one will scarcely die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person one would even dare to die. But God shows his love. That's an example of love for us, in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. He gave his life for you and for me. What will you give for him? If you have a need, please come while we stand and while we sing.